She told me I was trespassing on my own property. Then she fined me $500. When I showed her the deed, she sent surveyors. When I put up cameras, she sent landscapers to plant her sign on my dock. And when that failed, she committed a felony. This is the story of how an HOA president tried to steal my lake and ended up in handcuffs. I turned around, and there she was, Harriet Galloway, president of the Maple Shores HOA. Her hair didn't move. Her sunglasses were bigger than her face. And she was clutching a clipboard like it was the most powerful weapon on earth. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her shrill voice cutting through the morning air. I was standing on the edge of my dock, sipping coffee and watching the mist roll off the water. "I'm drinking coffee," I said. "You're trespassing," Harriet snapped. "This lake is for Maple Shores residents only," and I checked. "We don't have a Liam Dunker in our registry." I chuckled. "That's because I'm not in your HOA." "Exactly," she said, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "So, you'll need to leave the lakefront immediately." I took a long, slow sip. "Harriet, this lake and the land surrounding it is my property. I own it. You can check the county plat maps if you don't believe me." Her lips twitched. "You expect me to believe that one person can own an entire lake?" "No," I said. "I expect you to accept that I own this one." She scoffed and stormed off, muttering something about calling the board. I figured that would be the end of it. I'd been living here for 6 years on a secluded parcel that just happened to border the outer edge of Maple Shores. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. The lake, oddly shaped and tucked between lots, had always been mine, passed down from a great uncle who used it for duck hunting. But Harriet wasn't the type to let things go. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice duct-taped to my mailbox. Unauthorized use of shared natural resource. Fine, $500. I tore it off and walked it straight over to the HOA office, which was just a converted garage at the end of Willow Bend Drive. Harriet was inside arguing with a woman over the color of her mulch. As soon as she saw me, she pointed. "You again? Did you come to pay your fine?" "No," I said. "I came to tell you if you trespass on my property again, I'll have you charged." Harriet crossed her arms. "This is a community lake. It's in our charter. Your charter is outdated and doesn't override county records. I have the deed. I have the survey. The lake sits entirely on my land." She narrowed her eyes. "We'll see about that." And she did. Over the next week, I saw no fewer than 3 different surveyors poking around the edge of my property line. One even had the nerve to climb my fence. I called the sheriff's office, filed a report, and installed motion-activated cameras. Then, 2 days later, I found a group of HOA landscapers trying to plant a private HOA property sign on my dock. I came out with a printed copy of the county parcel map and a stack of legal documents. Touch that dock again, and I'll have you all up for trespassing. And Harriet? You'd better hope your little stunt with the sign doesn't qualify as attempted land seizure. She showed up later that evening, flanked by 2 board members, both just as nosy and petty-looking as she was. I stood on my porch while they yelled from the sidewalk like kids who weren't allowed to come past the gate. "You're ruining the aesthetic of our community." Harriet shouted. "You should be grateful we're even letting you use the lake." "Letting me," I said. "You've got this backward. You are the ones who should be grateful I haven't put up a fence and cut you off completely." Her face turned the color of a ripe tomato. "That dock violates our appearance standards." "It's not your dock, Harriet." She stormed off again, but not before yelling over her shoulder, "Don't think this is over, Mr. Dunker. You'll regret this." I thought I'd won. I was wrong. Because 3 days later, I found this wedged in my door. It was a formal notice of annexation. They were voting to take my land. Inside the envelope was a collection of amateur maps, a copy of their proposed amendment to the HOA bylaws, and, most absurdly, a hand-drawn diagram labeled Community Access Trail, pending approval. They were actually trying to claim eminent domain through an internal HOA vote. I drove straight to the county clerk's office. Tanya, who'd worked the counter for over 20 years, leaned over the desk as I laid out the HOA's paperwork. "They think they can just vote to take land that doesn't belong to them," she said, flipping through the documents. "They're not even subtle about it," I said. This one has a doodle of a picnic table next to my shed. She whistled. You want me to flag your parcel record? I can tag it with a note that says under attempted unauthorized claim, so it triggers a full review if they try anything legal. Do it, I said. And could you pull up their charter? I want to see what kind of circus rules they are operating under. She printed it out, and I spent the next 2 hours going through every clause, every amendment, every signature. It was like reading a badly written screenplay. Half the bylaws had been reworded without proper filing. One amendment, filed in pencil, claimed to regulate natural water features, but only listed 2 retention ponds near the entrance of the development. As far as the county was concerned, the lake wasn't even mentioned. That night, I called an old friend of mine from college, Russell Traeger. He was a municipal land use attorney in the next county over, the kind who thrived on exposing bureaucratic overreach. I'll take a look, he said after I emailed him everything. But from the sound of it, this woman's about to find out that HOA power stops at the property line. The next blow came the following Tuesday. I pulled into my driveway after work and found a glossy signpost planted at the edge of my lawn, right next to the mailbox. It read, Future Site of Maple Shores Community Pier. Construction begins July 1st. I stared at it for a full minute before taking a wrench from the back of my truck and yanking the thing out of the ground. The post had been driven in nearly 2 feet deep. They weren't bluffing. Someone had brought digging equipment onto my land. At that point, I stopped playing nice. I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's department. Deputy Weller came out that evening, took photos of the sign, and listened while I walked him through the whole saga. So, they filed an annexation proposal without owning the land, posted a construction notice on your property, and tried to hire surveyors to redraw lines, he asked. I nodded. And that's just what I can prove. He wrote it all down in his ledger. Normally, we'd say this is civil. But if they're physically altering property they don't own, that's criminal mischief at minimum. I'll file the report and forward it to the county prosecutor. A week later, Harriet showed up again, this time wearing a stiff navy pantsuit and toting a manila folder. She didn't walk up the driveway. She stood just outside the property line and called out like someone summoning a dog. Mr. Dunker, I'm offering you a final opportunity to cooperate with the community. I leaned against the porch post. You're not a community. You're a club with paperwork. This is your chance to avoid legal escalation, she said, waving the folder. We've already contracted a construction crew and voted the budget. If you interfere, you'll be liable for damages. You're about 1 trespass away from felony charges, I said. What's in the folder? More crayon maps. She flipped it open and held up a printed sheet. This is a petition. 67 homeowners have agreed that the lake should be a shared amenity. Let me guess, I said. You told them it was already yours, didn't you? She paused for just a second. The board agreed it was in the spirit of common benefit. County law doesn't care about your spirit. It cares about deeds. And I've got mine in ink, on record, and backed by a real attorney. Her jaw tensed. You're isolating yourself from your neighbors. I'm not your neighbor. I just happen to live next to your mess. That night, I installed 4 more security cameras. One pointed directly at the dock, another at the tree line where landscapers had wandered in the past. The next morning, the footage caught a man in a reflective vest walking along the shoreline with a measuring wheel. He never stepped on my grass, but he was clearly trying to chart something. I sent the video to Deputy Weller, who responded by visiting Harriet personally. According to what he told me later, she insisted her contractor had misunderstood the boundaries. She offered no explanation for why he was recording measurements on private property. And then, silence. Nothing for a week. No signs, no threats. It was the most unnerving part of the whole ordeal, because I knew she wasn't done. And I was right. My attorney called. What he found wasn't just petty harassment. It was criminal. You're going to love this, Russell said. The HOA submitted a claim to the zoning board last month. They listed the lake as a mutual-use green space and attached a map that redraws your boundary by over 60 feet. They what? They forged a zoning overlay and submitted it as an official document. The digital file even had a fake county stamp. I ran the metadata. It was created by someone named K. Galloway. I laughed once just to keep from punching something. Tell me that's enough for charges. It's enough for a fraud investigation. I've already forwarded it to the state attorney's office. I didn't hear from Harriet for another 5 days. Then, late Thursday evening, 2 unmarked county vehicles rolled into the neighborhood. Harriet was escorted from her home calmly, but with visible tension on her face. She wasn't in handcuffs, but the look on her face said she knew what was coming. The next day, the county issued a public notice: forgery and fraudulent land use filings under investigation at Maple Shores HOA. It spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up. A neighbor posted a video of Harriet being led to the county car. And within hours, every porch in Maple Shores had someone whispering about it. As it turned out, Harriet had been doing this for years, rewriting maps, doctoring boundary files, and using community votes to claim control over anything she didn't like. She'd expanded walking trails without permission, fined people for fences on their own land, and bullied elderly residents into voluntary compliance. But this time, she'd pushed too far. The county froze the HOA's pending budget and opened a full audit. The board was suspended pending the investigation. The construction crew canceled their contract. And me? I finally got silence. I walked down to the dock that Sunday morning. The lake was still, the air warm, the sky clear. No signs, no shouting, no surveyors. Just peace. And a fresh, no trespassing sign mounted cleanly at the edge of the grass. Rust-proof, legal, and backed by a court order. 3 weeks after Harriet's quiet departure from Maple Shores, I got a call from Deputy Weller. His tone was clipped, not his usual laid-back draw. "You might want to come down to the sheriff's office," he said. "There's something you need to see." I arrived 20 minutes later in jeans and a flannel shirt, expecting maybe an update or a few more forms to sign. Instead, Weller met me in the hallway outside the records room and motioned me into a small interview chamber. Inside, a man in a charcoal blazer stood beside a stack of folders, his ID clipped to his belt. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Pell. "We've expanded the investigation," Pell said, tapping the folders. "Turns out your case opened a very large can of worms." I leaned back, arms crossed. "How large are we talking?" He opened the top folder and rotated it toward me. Inside were photocopies of checks, each made out to Maple Shores Beautification Fund, endorsed by Harriet and 2 other board members. But what caught my eye were the account numbers. None of them matched the HOA's registered banking information. She was laundering assessment fees, Pell said. Tens of thousands of dollars funneled into a private account created under a fake nonprofit. The kicker? That account was used to pay contractors who never actually performed any work. Fake landscapers? I asked. He nodded. And phony maintenance crews. Ones that billed for shoreline work, which of course never happened because they didn't have access since the lake isn't theirs. My stomach turned. So, they were using made-up services on land they didn't own to siphon money from residents. Exactly, Pell said. And your footage, the signpost, even the dock measurements helped trace how far they were willing to fabricate ownership. It's not just zoning fraud anymore. We're filing charges for conspiracy to defraud, wire fraud, and criminal impersonation of a municipal agency. I exhaled slowly. How many people are going down with her? 3 board members so far. Possibly a 4th if we link the forged zoning overlay to her husband. He worked in the county registrar's office until 6 months ago. That made sense. It explained how the Galloway files slipped into the system with a fake stamp. They weren't just power-hungry. They were organized. What do you need from me now? I asked. We want you to testify at the preliminary hearing next month, Pell said. Your documentation is airtight. And since the original trespassing began on your property, your records establish the timeline of escalation. I agreed. This wasn't about a lake anymore. It was about the principle. If she could do this to me with a forged piece of paper, who else was she bullying into silence? I wasn't about to let Harriet wriggle out of this. Not after the months of harassment, the forged petitions, and the silent invasion of my land. She tried to rewrite reality, and now the law was rewriting her future. Back at home, I noticed something else had changed in the neighborhood. For the first time since moving in, Residents from Maple Shores started waving as they passed. A few even stopped to introduce themselves properly. One woman, retired court stenographer named June, brought over a homemade peach cobbler as a kind of apology. "I voted for that petition," she said, eyes downcast. "Harriet told us we were losing the lake to a private developer. Said you plan to build condos?" I raised an eyebrow. "Condos out here?" "I know," she said, flustered. But she had diagrams, made it sound urgent. I invited her onto the porch, and we talked for an hour. It turned out Harriet had been feeding the neighborhood a steady diet of half-truths and scare tactics for years. Every new policy was framed as necessary to preserve home values. Every dissenting voice was labeled a threat. June wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, a slow trickle of residents came by, some offering apologies, others asking for advice. Apparently, now that the board was suspended, no one knew who to call about basic issues like garbage pickup or tree trimming. I found myself becoming an unofficial advisor simply because I had answers. I showed a young couple how to check plat maps online. I helped an elderly man dispute a fine they tried to enforce retroactively. And when someone asked how to call a community meeting without the board's approval, I pointed them to the state HOA statute that allowed for a full member vote under emergency conditions. That meeting took place in the Maple Shores Park 3 Saturdays later. No one wore suits. No one brought a gavel. They sat on folding chairs and picnic benches and passed around lemonade. I stayed back near a tree watching. They voted unanimously to dissolve the current HOA structure and petition the state mediator for oversight. It wasn't a full revolution, but it was something better. Accountability. By the time Harriet's hearing rolled around, I had nearly forgotten how smug she looked that first day on my shoreline. She sat in the courtroom next to a public defender, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Her hair was pinned back, her blouse buttoned too high as if dressed by someone trying to blend into the wallpaper. When my name was called, I took the stand and told the truth. I described the forged maps, the illegal signpost, the landscapers with no contracts. I submitted the footage, the county records, and the notarized deed that had started it all. Harriet never looked up. After 2 hours of testimony, the judge approved the charges for trial. Harriet was released under bond, but the courtroom buzzed with the weight of what was coming. She wasn't facing fines anymore. She was facing prison time. Outside, Pell shook my hand. "You did more than protect your land," he said. "You protected a community from someone who thought she could create her own kingdom." "I just wanted her to leave my dock alone," I said. Sometimes that's all it takes. As I walked to my truck, a pair of teenagers were skipping stones across the lake. One of them pointed toward my dock and asked the other if they thought it was okay to go that far out. "Not unless they're invited," the second said. "That guy owns the whole lake." I smiled and climbed in. The odd thing? I'd never really wanted to be known out here. I moved for the quiet, the solitude, the water. But now I wasn't just the guy at the edge of the lake. I was the reason Maple Shores was finally free of its tyrant. And they knew it. 2 weeks later, I received a certified envelope, this time from the county recorder's office. Inside was a letter stating that due to confirmed zoning fraud and forgery, all false filings made by the Maple Shores HOA had been expunged. My records were restored, unchallenged, and locked. The lake was mine again, not just by paper, but by piece. No more signs, no more foot traffic, no more clipboards. And somewhere across town, Harriet Galloway was preparing for the trial of her life. The trial began on a gray Monday in mid-April. Rain tapped on the courthouse windows like it had something to say, and inside the air was thick with anticipation. I sat behind the prosecution's table, not out of necessity anymore, but because I wanted to see it through. Harriet Galloway, once the self-proclaimed guardian of Maple Shores, now hunched at the defendant's table, her crisp blazers replaced by a dull gray cardigan. Her attorney, a public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in days, flipped through a binder of documents with a growing sense of futility. The courtroom filled faster than expected. Not just residents from Maple Shores, but people from nearby communities, folks who'd heard the story and wanted to see what happened when an HOA finally went too far. Several brought thick folders of their own, hoping this case might set precedent for their own battles with overreaching neighborhood boards. The prosecution opened strong. ADA Pell laid out the charges in clear, steady terms: fraudulent land use filings, falsified zoning documents, illegal disbursement of community funds, and conspiracy to impersonate a municipal entity. He presented the timeline like a puzzle falling into place piece by piece, showing how each action Harriet took was calculated to expand her control at the expense of property rights and legal boundaries. Then came the witnesses. First, Tanya from the county clerk's office, who confirmed the fake zoning overlay wasn't just unauthorized, but digitally altered using credentials from a former county employee, Harriet's husband, Kenneth Galloway. He'd quietly resigned months earlier, right around the time the forged documents showed up in the registrar system. Next came a forensic accountant who traced over $80,000 in assessment fees into a shell account labeled Maple Shores Natural Improvements Initiative. That account, it turned out, had been used to pay for personal expenses, a new deck on Harriet's house, a luxury spa membership, and even a vacation to St. George Island, all disguised as community enrichment spending. When it was my turn to take the stand again, Pell didn't ask me to repeat the earlier testimony. Instead, he guided me through the aftermath, how the false filings were discovered, how the county voided them, and how the attempted construction on my land had triggered the dominoes that brought the whole scheme down. What was the moment you realized this wasn't just about a dock or a lake, he asked. When I saw the petition, I said, not because of what it said, but because of how many people had signed it. Harriet had convinced them I was the one trying to take something away. That's when I understood she wasn't just breaking rules. She was rewriting them to make herself untouchable. Harriet's attorney tried to pivot during cross-examination. He asked if I'd ever considered joining the HOA voluntarily, whether I might have avoided this entire ordeal by simply cooperating. You don't cooperate with someone trespassing on your land, I said. You stop them. The defense rested soon after. It was clear they had nothing solid, no legitimate documentation, no real counterarguments, just the vague suggestion that Harriet had been misinformed or acting in good faith. But the paper trail said otherwise. Intent was written all over every forged submission and every misused dollar. When the jury returned after only 4 hours of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a seasoned former state prosecutor with little patience for manipulation, delivered sentencing the following week. Harriet was sentenced to 6 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 4. Her husband was charged separately, but struck a plea deal in exchange for testifying against the other board members. They too faced charges ranging from wire fraud to conspiracy to commit zoning violations. The fallout hit Maple Shores like a thunderclap. With the board dissolved, the community entered state receivership pending full restructuring. An independent administrator was appointed to manage daily affairs, and a public hearing was scheduled to determine whether the HOA should be permanently dismantled. At that hearing, held in the community gymnasium, a surprisingly diverse group of residents showed up. Young families, retirees, veterans, small business owners. People who'd once been passive now stood at the mic one after another, detailing how they'd been fined for made-up violations, coerced into voluntary landscaping upgrades, or threatened with foreclosure over late fees that had never been properly invoiced. One man, a retired Navy machinist, stepped up with a cane and a ledger of his own. I fought overseas for freedom, he said. I didn't come back to be told what color my blinds had to be or fined for watering my lawn on the wrong day. This wasn't a homeowners association. It was a racket with a mailing list. The vote wasn't close. 81% of the residents opted to dissolve the HOA entirely. What remained of its assets, mostly unused funds and office equipment, was transferred into a community trust managed by a 5-person volunteer board elected on the spot. No salaries, no fines, just neighbors helping each other maintain the place they all called home. Sometime after the trial, I received an envelope from the county. Inside was a formal certificate of recognition for preserving private property rights and assisting in the exposure of widespread municipal fraud. It looked official, but I pinned it to my workshop wall with a magnet shaped like a fish. I didn't need a plaque to remind me why I'd stood my ground. I had the lake. I had my land, and now I had peace again. The cameras stayed up just in case, but I no longer checked them every morning. The path behind the trees had grown over since the landscapers stopped coming. Deer wandered down to the water now. Birds nested in the reeds again. A family of otters even moved in near the far bend. Every so often, one of my new neighbors would wave from across the water or bring fresh produce from their garden. But they never crossed the boundary, never asked to fish off the dock, never suggested sharing the lake. They knew now, not just because of the court case, but because the truth had finally settled in like sediment at the bottom of the water. One afternoon, as I was fixing a loose rail on the dock, a teenage boy from across the street wandered up to the edge of his yard and called out. "My dad says you're the reason we still live here," he said. I nodded. "Tell him he's the reason I stayed." Then I went back to my rail because that's what I'd always wanted in the end. Not recognition, not revenge, just the right to fix my dock in peace without needing permission from someone with a clipboard and control issues. Harriet had claimed I wasn't a part of her HOA. She was right. But the lake, the land, the silence, those were mine and they always would be. And me? I was finally preparing for a sunrise. Coffee in hand. Feet on my dock. And for the first time in a long time, the only sound was the water. Not a single set of heels crunching through the gravel.